Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reedy with Future Pastimes, and I'm the designer of Firefly Misbehavin, which is a deck building game set in the Firefly verse. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the cards from one of the market decks. Now, there are 3 market decks. There's a core deck, border deck, and a rim deck. So it's different areas of space in the Firefly verse. And the cards from those decks reflect what you might expect to find in there. Now, each of the decks in the base game has 25 cards for each of these market decks, but they are divided up into 3 categories, and it's very subtle, but at the very bottom, you've got a little shape. So about a third of them have a little triangle symbol, about a third of them have a little square symbol, and the other third, the third that we're going to be talking about, are the circle ones. Now, some of the episode cards will dictate to only use certain elements of each of those decks, core, border, and rim. The circle ones are going to be in every game. So, and that's because they contain your most familiar characters, certainly the other stars of the show who are not part of Serenity's starting deck. And remember, Serenity's starting deck only has Mal and Zoe. So the other characters are in the different decks. They are mostly in the border and core decks. And it's the characters you would expect. So the Tams, for instance, are in the core deck because that's where they were from, was the core area, and that's where they picked up Book as well. But the other characters are border characters, and that's where you would tend to get them. Now, you don't have to play with the whole 25-card market deck for each of those markets. You can just use 2 of them. You can even use just 1. So sometimes when we play, we just use the circle. So it's 8 cards. Even with just 8 cards, you're not always going to acquire all 8 of those cards from each of the markets. And even if you do, you still have 2 other markets from which to recruit cards. But the game usually is going to end before you would need, get all 8 of the cards out of that particular deck. So we're going to look at the circle cards in the border deck, what's in those cards, and what their effects are, and we'll just go in alphabetical order. So our first card is the Graviton Accelerator. It's an item, costs 4. It has no influence there, but it does have 2 power, so when it's in your tableau, it's getting you that much closer to a standard victory condition. It has a triggered ability. That means you have to spend an activation to do it. You trigger this card, and then you trigger a ship in your tableau. And that lets you draw 2 cards. So it's just by the virtue of having this item in your tableau and also having a ship, lets you trigger those cards, basically tap them if you're used to that term for Magic the Gathering. And then it lets you draw 2 cards. So that could be very helpful to you if you're in a fight, if you have the activation to do this. So this requires its own activation to do that. Not in a fight, you maybe do it to draw more cards that have influence that you might want to get for recruiting something that costs more. But if you've got 2 verse tokens, for instance, most of the factions can spend that for an activation. So in the middle of a fight, if you don't have enough fight cards in your hand or in your tableau, the Graviton Accelerator could let you draw a couple more cards that could be useful in that fight. So it can be a pretty handy card, and 4 is pretty reasonable. Our next card is Wash, Hoban Washburn here. He costs 5, but notice he has the Serenity faction icon in the corner, and that means that Serenity can spend verse tokens to discount the cost. For each token that they spend, Wash costs 1 less. So it's almost like using verse tokens as influence. Lower that price. So this is a character, 1 influence, so you can use Wash for future recruitments and deals. 2 power when he's in the tableau. Doesn't have the fight icon. He's not much of a fighter. But he has this ability, and it does not require an activation. So as long as Wash is in your tableau, you can use this ability. You discard Wash and a ship that's in your tableau to evade a fight. In fact, these cards don't even need to be in your tableau. It doesn't say anything about in the tableau. It's just discarded. So if you have one or both of them in your hand, you can discard them to evade a fight. So while Wash himself is not particularly useful in a fight in this game, it can get you out of a sticky situation. So very useful card indeed. Our next character is Jane. So Jane Cobb. Now he costs a little bit more, but he's got a little bit more he can do. He costs 6. No discount for anybody in there. He just goes to whoever can afford him. Useful in a fight, 3 power in a fight. And that's one of the reasons why it costs 6. So no influence on there. Now, Jane has a special condition here, mandatory. You have to pay a credit or else you have to discard Jane from your tableau. So if you've got him in the tableau because you want to add that 3 power towards victory condition, you need to keep paying him to stick around. Now, if you're not worried about having the tableau, you just want to have a 3 power fight card that's in your deck that you can draw to win fights. You don't have to worry about paying him for that. He enjoys fighting almost as much as getting paid. But the other ability that he has it requires an activation to draw 3 cards. So you could use an activation to play Jane, trigger him for his ability, and draw 3 cards. If you pay a credit, you can leave him in the tableau. Otherwise, you just discard him for free. So being able to draw 3 cards can be very useful. In a fight, I mean, the 3 power is probably more useful to you, unless you have a lot of misbehave cards, for instance, in your deck, and you're like, I would rather use Jane to try to get to those cards. That would be a good use, but this would be good for getting to other cards in your deck that you need, probably for recruitment. Next up, we have Kaylee. So she also costs 5, but she's got, again, the Serenity icon. That means that, and if they've got this particular faction's icon in there, they're predisposed to wanting to be in that deck. So Kaylee wants to be in Serenity's deck. That's why you can discount her with verse tokens to lower her recruitment cost. She also 1 influence, so it's a good card to get early on because you can use it to recruit more cards. 1 power in there. Also a decent ability, so it costs an activation. So if you play Kaylee and trigger her for ability, or if you've already got her in the tableau and you use your activation to just trigger her for her ability, it lets you draw 3 cards, adding 1 to your hand and discarding the other. So if there's a particular card that you didn't draw that you were really hoping to draw, and again, it could be Misbehave, it could be some other card with a lot of influence or a specific ability, and you thought you might have drawn it, but you didn't. This lets you get into 3 cards into the top of your deck to hopefully get to that card that you want. Our next card, Mare's Leg. It costs 4. It's an item. No special ability, but it does have the fight attribute, so you can use this in the fight, and it adds 2 power to that fight. So a pretty handy item to have. Put it in the tableau or leave it in your deck. Next up, we have Saffron. So Saffron is a character, high cost, but she can make deals. She can be in fights and adds 1 power to that fight. She also has 1 influence, so she's using for deals and recruitments. But she has a very unique and interesting ability, and it doesn't require an activation. So if Saffron is in your tableau, you can discard her from the tableau to retain a supply card played to your display area. Now, in every other circumstance, when you play a supply card, once its effect is resolved, it returns to the supply. You can't keep those cards. Those would be your shinies, your misbehaves, your maneuvers. But if you discard Saffron, you get to retain it. Retain means it goes back into your hand. So you could then potentially use it again in that same turn. But if nothing else, you're keeping it in your deck. So that is a very handy ability that does require you to basically recycle her. But very handy. All right, get down to the last 2. We have St. Albans. It's a location. It costs 5. It has no influence, but it has 3 power. So a good card to have for going towards that power victory condition. It has an activatable ability, and that is that when you do that, you're just basically triggering it, turn it sideways to show that you're doing it. Each player may shuffle their recycle pile and then draw 1 card at random from it. So you're not putting that recycle into your deck, but you're shuffling it and drawing a card at random. So there's some goodies in there if you've discarded some things that you know, wow, I could really use this right now. That's how to do it. But it is going to benefit the other players as well. So that's the trade-off. You're getting to do it. Now, sometimes the other players might not have a recycle. Their whole deck has been reshuffled and it's ready to draw, so they won't get any benefit from it. And if they only have 1 card, well, then they don't need to shuffle it. That's just the card that they're going to get. But again, if you've got stuff in there like you need more influence or you need something for a fight and it's in your recycle, you have at least a chance to get it. And that brings us to our last card, and that is the Thunderbird. And this is the type of ship that Jubal Early flies. It costs 5. It is a ship. It has 1 influence, so it's pretty handy to have. 2 power, and it has an ability, cost and activation. It lets you shuffle your recycle pile and draw a card at random from it. So very similar. It's the same effect as St. Albans, but this one, it only benefits you and not everybody else. So these are the cards. Like I said, they're going to be in pretty much every game, but the frequency with which you are likely to draw some or all of these cards is going to really depend on how many cards are in your market deck. So if you're playing with the whole thing, that's 25 cards. It's going to be a 1 in 3 chance that you're going to get any of these cards when they're drawn. And in a typical game of Misbehavin, you don't go through very many of the cards in each market. There's always going to be 2 face up, but over the course of a game, you are likely to recruit between 6 and 10 cards, and that's probably at the high end. I'm usually getting a lot of cards from the supply set, so I'm getting shinies and misbehaves, especially later in the game. So not recruiting as much from the markets, but it just depends. With some of the episode cards, the win conditions change and other elements of the game change, so you may be drawing from those decks more. And anytime you are looking for specific types of cards in the deck, the episode cards will typically eliminate part of those market decks. So they'll say use the circle cards and then maybe one other, like use the triangles or use the squares. That means you're more likely to draw the types of cards. So there's episodes where you have to get ships or you have to get certain characters. And the division of these decks by those symbols makes it more likely you're going to get to those things that are relevant to an episode. But as I mentioned earlier, I sometimes would just use the circles. That means that those characters are definitely going to show up in the game, at least some of them, and maybe even all of them. And it makes it a little bit more thematic. It lets you get into there. It really lets you curate the type of experience that you want with Misbehavin. So if you have not experimented with limiting your market decks, let me know what you think of that. Or if you have, let me know your thoughts on those. If you have any other questions on it, let me know. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.